Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. In part 1 of Evolution of Gaming Controllers, we were pretty much all dials to D-pads, everything up to the 5th generation of consoles, and just before the jump to real 3D. So if you haven't listened to part 1, we highly suggest you do, but in any case, let's kick straight into it.
So, picking up the evolution of controllers at this time, namely the mid 90s, is actually really cool. Because many of the things that make up our modern day console controllers actually started here.
Yeah, some very interesting things start happening here, definitely.
Yeah, like haptic feedback, dual analog sticks, consistent button layouts. Wow. Like, that's actually a big deal, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. I mean, gone is the days of the Wild West. Now we kind of have something similar going on for from generation to generation.
Yeah, and I definitely know what you love probably the most wireless controllers because
Yeah.
you want to be chilling without all of those cables bothering you.
I want to be able to play with the controller underneath the blanket on those cold winter days.
Well, definitely. And all of these things started around this time, the mid 90s, and really defined how we play games today and what we in fact expect to as well in future consoles and controllers to come.
Yeah, 100%.
That's not to say, though, that this will be a boring episode because you probably know everything, Player One. But you know what? No, quite the contrary, actually. It was a long experimental road with many twists and turns that we're going to explore. So, JP, do you want to get to the first twist of the day?
Yeah, let us start exploring. So, here we are. It's the mid 90s, and probably nobody would have thought that there would ever be an end to the epic console war Nintendo versus Sega. But there was a company ready to settle the score and get Mario and Sonic to lay down their weapons. Sony releases the PlayStation 1 in 1994. I mean, back then it was called the PlayStation, but just to keep it simple, we'll call it the
Yeah.
PlayStation 1.
Yeah, there was no PlayStation Zero, so
No,
hey,
there
it's
wasn't.
just the only one.
But with the crazy naming conventions that are happening these days, who knows if there will be a PlayStation Zero one day?
You know what? I'm actually really thankful to Sony to always be consistent in their naming convention.
That is true. That is true. In any case, they released the PlayStation 1 in 94 and lay a solid foundation for video game controllers for generations to come. And in fact, has since the first PlayStation never changed the core design of its controller, only building on top of it with new features and minor redesigns to compensate for those extra features. The PS1's controller, model SCPH-1010, and SCPH stands for Sony Computer PlayStation Hardware, was a groundbreaking revolutionary controller and ahead of its time too. But this original controller was not the one that you might be imagining in your head, Player One. This is still the one without dual analog sticks. It is based on the SNES's dog-bone shaped controller, which makes sense because Sony originally wanted to work together with Nintendo to make the Nintendo PlayStation, and that still sounds so weird for me to say. But Nintendo actually ditched Sony, and Sony was forced to work on that console solo, right? The designer of the controller, Teiyu Goto, respected Nintendo's SNES and said that, quote unquote, the SNES was a huge hit at the time, and naturally, we wanted SNES gamers to upgrade to our system. That's why the management department didn't want the controller to be a radical departure. They said it had to be a standard type of design, or gamers would not accept it.
Yeah, I actually really agree with that statement.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we see now how we are looking at developers trying to build on top of what was done previously, what worked well, rather than completely reinventing the wheel every time.
Yeah, and that's no wonder, right? Sony spent enormous focus and attention to the design of the PS1 controller, according to former CEO Ken Kutaragi, who previously worked with Nintendo to create the sound chip for SNES. During the development, they would add just 1 gram to a prototype gamepad, one at a time, until they found the perfect balance for the gamepad. So, can say that they probably spent around as much time on a controller as they did on the PS1 hardware itself. And what a wise decision that turned out to be.
Certainly. This is the kind of level of detail I expect from a developer when making a controller too.
Yeah, and you know what? Sony's president, so it's the president of Sony itself, Norio Oga, also paid special interest to the controller and very strongly supported the final version. So, yeah, imagine the level of attention to detail that they put towards this controller as much as their first console itself.
Yeah, from very high level too.
Yeah, and if we think of the SNES controller that it's based on, we can really get a good understanding for how the PS1 controller took its final shape, with the PlayStation being designed to be a 3D home console first and foremost. Two additional shoulder buttons were added to the controller, so that's L2 and R2, in addition to what they call L1 and R1, left, right. Yeah, that makes sense, right?
Yeah, two new shoulder buttons.
Yes, two new shoulder
Nice.
buttons. Yeah. So this was intended to facilitate that 3D movements in games. So in case you're kind of wondering why PlayStation would make a controller for 3D console but no analog stick, well, this is actually the answer. L2 and R2 was their initial design choice.
Yeah,
Just use that shoulder button. We don't need an analog stick.
that's right. Yeah. hmm I imagine L2 backwards, R2 move forwards, and
Yeah,
then with the D-pad, well, yeah. Look
direction.
left, right, up,
Mm,
down. Yeah.
kind of makes sense to be fair. However, though, with the middle fingers now placed at the top of the pad to accommodate, the four shoulder buttons instead of behind the pad, there was a balancing issue at the bottom. So, to provide a better grip to the pad, Sony added the handles to compensate for the imbalance compared to the SNES gamepad, basically.
But since Nintendo had patented the D-pad, Sony would have to alter its own D-pad in some significant way to make it different and not get sued. So Sony chose to have four separate buttons actually now. So up, down, left, right was an individual button, and they did not connect at the center to get around the patenting issue and therefore making it different than Nintendo's.
Mhm.
The four face buttons on the right hand side are perhaps the most obvious legacy of Sony's inspiration from the SNES controller, with an iconic typography that definitely stood the test of time. Did you know, Player One, the trademark face buttons, the blue X, the red circle, the pink square, and the green triangle, were intended to serve very specific purposes? The X and circle were actually intended as cancel and confirm buttons. So, yeah, makes sense. Blue X, no, and circle, okay. Though it seems that outside of Japan, players actually gravitated to doing it the other way around. So, X would be your, yeah, go, do, okay. And if you want to go back, so that's circle. And eventually they would swap that around permanently now for modern gaming languages. The pink square was intended to represent a piece of paper, so to symbolize a menu, and the green triangle was to symbolize a point of view. And yeah, it's a diamond shaped layout again. So
Yeah.
again, this NES controller inspiration there. Let's move on to some other controllers though, but keep in mind, Player One, as we progress now through this timeline, the PS1 is still without its dual analog sticks.
So the next one, Sega, of course, was at this time still a household name, and up until this point, one of the biggest competitors in the gaming industry. Unfortunately, their system was rushed out to be released 4 months ahead of schedule in the US, and its selling price was $100 more than of the PS1 because Saturn was priced on $399, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Quite steep for the time.
Yeah, and it did release 11 days earlier than the PS1. 11 days. That's not a long time, basically. But the console performed poorly and is considered, unfortunately, to be a commercial failure. Anyway, let's talk about the gamepad. Technically, it was the most advanced controller at the time, but only for 11 days,
Only for 11 days.
unfortunately. The Saturn featured a rounded D-pad, 6 face buttons, and new for Sega, 2 shoulder buttons, which replaced the mode button of their previous controllers. Comically, the gamepads they released outside of Japan were actually bigger to accommodate for quote unquote larger hands.
Oh, yeah, those large hands that we have, right?
So this MK8100 gamepad also featured a strangely shaped concave D-pad that made it, by most accounts, worse than the Japanese version, because the Japanese version is like normal D-pad, like
Yeah.
just normal. And in 1996, they would release the Japanese style gamepads worldwide instead, and Sega never returned to the concave gamepads, thank God. Still no analog stick at this point, though they would eventually release a monstrosity called 3D Control Pad in 1996. You will find out why specifically in 1996 too, though, so hold on to that thought. The 3D control pad is perfectly round shaped with tiny handles at the bottom. I don't even know what purpose they're serving. It's a bit strange, in my honest opinion.
They might as well not be there.
I know, yeah. And it's just not looking any ergonomically cool whatsoever. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not a fan. Sega, sorry. But this one, the 3D control pad, has one analog stick at the top left of the gamepad.
Yes.
To give credit where credit is due, though, the Sega Saturn's original Japanese gamepad is actually quite beautiful if it wasn't for the poor performing console, for 2D games especially. It could have given the SNES some serious competition, but no competition whatsoever with what Nintendo would release soon. What does Nintendo have in their bag?
Let me tell you, it was model number NUS 005 controller. So, Nintendo releases the Nintendo 64 in 1996, and it was a very divisive controller too, let me tell you. And it really is divisive. It has some hardcore fans, I am one of them, but also critics.
I am one of them.
Oh, you're also fun.
No, the critics.
Okay.
Sorry.
The controller was designed by Nintendo's R&D3 team. The general manager of R&D3 at the time, Genyo Takeda, encouraged his team to think of new ideas and how, in true Nintendo style, with every new console, their goal is to set new standards for controllers. And they tried many different prototypes first. And throwing many of them away, of course, as well. Not every idea is golden, right? But with every iteration of a new prototype, they will become more and more ambitious. And get this, they at one point even tried out a motion sensor wristwatch.
What?
Yes. Yeah, giving you like future vibes a
I
little
know.
bit. Interesting too, so while working on Super Mario 64, Shigeru Miyamoto has told that the controller prototype was solidified together with some of the game's mechanics like movement. And Super Mario 64, of course, would become the role model for game developers everywhere how to successfully control and navigate a character in 3D space, just to back up what the N64 controller did for us, right? The controller, and I'm sure most people are familiar with it, has an M shape to it, and it certainly stands out as a unique way of designing a controller. After all, most people only have two hands, not three, a joke that has been told many times before.
It's not a joke for me. I was saying that in true confusion. As in, like, what am I supposed to do with this? How am I supposed to use all of this?
There is rhyme and reason for it, and we'll get into it, but first,
I know, I know.
let's see what the controller looks like. So we have three handles, as we've said. So on the left-hand side, the left handle, we have our beloved Nintendo patented D-pad. On the right-hand handle, six face buttons. We got two large A and B buttons and four smaller C buttons, which stands for camera. In the middle handle, we have drum roll, An analog stick.
Yay!
Although small technicality, it wasn't truly analog. Modern controllers use a potentiometer. The N64 control stick actually used optical encoding discs. Basically, it's very similar to how old ball mouse used to work for the PC. And it converted a position into a digital value, but technicalities aside, for all intents and purposes, it's an analog stick. And we have a start button in the middle, two shoulder buttons, and a mysteriously hidden Z button that is found where the index finger would naturally rest when gripping the middle handle. And yes, this is why Sega released their 3D control pad with an analog stick the same year. So what's going on here? Head of R&D3, Genyo Takeda, told in an interview that players can be stubborn. And I mean, he's not wrong to be fair. Players are used to a D-pad on the left and the face buttons on the right. 3D games were brand new territory, and Nintendo was aware that developers may be apprehensive of creating 3D games. Who knew it was just a fad for a while, right? But Nintendo knew they would need an analog stick for 3D movement when required by the game. So they decided to create three methods of using the controller, and providing a great controller for both 2D and 3D games was key. And that is why we have three handles, Gabby.
Yeah, and apparently you're punishing me because I'm criticizing about the three handles for me to go through how to use all three handles.
Please explain to player one how it all works.
Right, so basically, right, the controller could be held by the left and right handle, abandoning the middle one. Classic style for 2D games with the D-pad, face buttons, and shoulder buttons. So, you know what, like normal person playing video games, holding it on both sides. In fact, using it this way closely resembles the SNES pad, but with six buttons on the right to mimic the popularity of the Sega Genesis six face button use, basically. The second method would be to use the middle handle with the analog stick with access to the Z button and the right hand side face buttons as well as the right shoulder button. Basically, the way you imagine it, just hold it in the middle with your left hand and hold the right side with your right hand, abandoning the left side of the gamepad. This is the style most people will be familiar with if playing any 3D games on the N64.
Yeah, like most of them, definitely. So, Super Mario 64, Zelda, Mario Kart, like many of them were using this style to hold the controller.
Yep. So, lastly, the game could be played with the left and middle handle, and this served well for FPS games with the D pad controlling the movement with your left hand and the analog stick for aiming, and two buttons, basically the left shoulder button and the set button, for actions. Probably shoot and use, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think I've played FPS games with that, so.
I had an N64 and plenty of games too. I did not have an FPS on the N64 somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, there you have it, player one. You can use two handles, right, left, and then middle, right, and middle, left. That's why they have all three. Quite greedy, but anyway.
I should add that with FPS we mean first person shooter.
Oh,
Just
yes,
just in case
sorry.
you're wondering. We don't want to get too lingo-y here at Gaming History Club.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's true. The controller also featured a slot in the back for add ons. Its main purpose at release was for a memory pack. The reasoning behind adding a memory pack to the controller instead of the console is actually quite humble too. So if you wanted to visit your friend with your saved game progress or ghost driver data like Mario Kart 64, you could just take your controller as one unit neatly together.
I think that's a really cute reason. I think yeah, that's cool. I could totally see it. Yeah.
The slot found many other uses too, though. Later, a Rumble Pack would be released, and almost all games following the release of the Rumble Pack incorporated the use of it. Finally, right, a mainstream console with a haptic feedback option? Wow,
We got some rumble action going on finally.
I know. but it didn't come as standard with the console. Still, it became an integral feature for controllers in later generations. And of course, another use for the slot is for the transfer pack, allowing you to play with your Game Boy Pokemon on a Nintendo 64, which I could totally imagine JP probably did a lot.
I did do that a lot.
I
As a matter
know.
of fact, yes, I did. Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, of course.
Yes. The controller's biggest downfall is, however, the control stick. It was plastic on plastic and could wear out easily, causing the stick to become loose after just a couple years of moderate use. It was a small stick with a thin top. Some games like Mario Party had instances where players had to turn the control stick as quickly as possible, and a common way of doing so was by rotating the stick with the palm of your hand, which could cause blisters. And in fact, Nintendo had to send protective gloves to players that complained about getting blisters after playing Mario Party.
That's right.
They should have added a clause in their agreement of like, any excessive playing, it's your problem, players, not
Ah,
Nintendo's
see.
problem.
But if they didn't include that clause for the release of the console, then yeah, can't get around.
I know,
Mm.
yeah, and some people at Nintendo found this to be somewhat ludicrous, to be fair, but this is how they settled the complaint made to the New York Attorney General's office, sending gloves.
Sending gloves. They should have called them the power gloves.
Is that gonna be better than the real power gloves, you think?
Yes.
To stop blisters?
Yeah.
At least they have function.
Yeah, at least it works. It works as intended.
Oh god, no, we're not here to diss the power gloves. Sorry, Nintendo.
Different episode.
But the controller was highly praised anyway, and critically well received at launch. And it's only when comparing it to the groundbreaking dual analog stick that the PS1 would release the following year, in 97, that it would be mocked for quote unquote flawed design. But remember, until now, up to this point, nobody made a mainstream console with out of the box analog stick design for real 3D games. It was Nintendo's courage to try something new, accommodating to both 2D and 3D games and gamers of all ages, that provided a baseline for how to control a character in a new dimension.
Sony responded to Nintendo's successful and innovative use of an analog stick in 1997 with the dual analog controller for the PlayStation 1. And this controller from 97 continues to lay the foundation of controllers almost 30 years later still. And it was a simple addition, two big analog sticks that more comfortably sat underneath the thumb than the N64's controller did, positioned in a way that the thumbs could be very quickly and ergonomically moved between four buttons each and the analog sticks. And also, because of the addition of the two extra shoulder buttons L2 and R2, there was no balancing issue either, with the middle fingers already sitting on top of L2 and R2. It gave the thumbs the support needed to move around freely without just dropping the pad. The handles were also extended to give the ring and pinky finger more handle to grab onto. It actually seems incredibly lucky coincidence, to be fair, that you could just incorporate two analog sticks into the original PS1's controller design, but it certainly wasn't an uncalculated or easy choice for Sony either, though, because two analog sticks must have been a very alien idea as well, and a number of games couldn't even be played with the analog sticks either. Sony therefore added the button in the middle that would allow for toggling between analog and digital controls. But no product is perfect though. While Sony's home in Japan saw the dual analog controller released with a rumble feature, in North America and Europe the feedback was dropped. And there's actually a couple of rumors floating around of why that might be. One of them was because Nintendo threatened that they would sue them because they had the Rumble Pack add-on for the N64 pad. And there's another rumor that Atari actually held patents going back all the way to 1991 for rumble features in a controller. But in all likelihood, Sony was simply trying to keep the price down in order to persuade players worldwide to buy a new controller. for the PS1 when they already had one anyway. Japanese players reportedly felt that the handles had also been made too long now, and with these two complaints mostly, Sony decided to give the PS1 controller one more redesign.
Yes, so Sony releases another controller for the PS1 in 1998, probably with the coolest controller name we've seen by now as well, the aptly named DualShock controller. The DualShock refined the handles, as per the complaint, basically, and by the naming convention, clearly also includes haptic feedback rumble goodness. A slick finishing touch, too. So the thumbsticks that were previously slightly dipped inwards and smooth now instead were more flat or actually slightly dome shaped with rubber to make them more comfortable to hold.
Yeah, and no doubt did it really do that. That is a really nice little finishing touch, as you mentioned, Gabby. It really makes loads of difference. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah, because you want to play games for a long time, so
You don't
there
want
you
the
go.
analog sticks like slipping around underneath your thumb in the heat of the game when your thumb's already getting sweaty and Resident Evil is happening.
Probably another blisters coming to your thumb and you need gloves to play PS1.
Power gloves.
No! Right, so though Sony required an extra do-over to give us the complete package, it was a wise decision. The DualShock controller will continue to live on for the next 3 generations, with upgrades we'll get into later, of course, but never straying far away from the core concept of this controller. The first game to explicitly require the dual analog or the DualShock controller was actually one of my all-time favorite. It was 99's Ape Escape, released a whooping 5 years after the release of the PlayStation itself.
Wow, that was a lot to get through, right? But you know what? It completely makes sense. The mid to late 90s and the fifth generation of controllers had a very difficult challenge, and there was no precedent for this. How do we make 3D games control well for players? Thanks to Nintendo's innovative and brave spirit and the inspiration and competition it gave to Sony to refine the concept with two analog sticks, we got there within just one generation. But we still have a lot to cover, so let's get back into the good stuff.
The first console to make an appearance in this generation, so the sixth generation, was sadly Sega's last, the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast had a great library of games, but it didn't perform well enough to keep up. Based on a Saturn 3D controller, which was probably its biggest downfall.
Yeah, it was not a great controller to use as your role model, was it?
Yeah, I don't think so. The Dreamcast controller was received mostly negatively, though it did have fans for some innovative choices. The Dreamcast controller featured just one analog stick on the left hand side of the pad and one D pad underneath the analog stick. On the right side, there were four face buttons and just two shoulder buttons, instead of PlayStation's four shoulder buttons.
Right.
Definitely somewhat of a minimalist design choice with fewer buttons than its competitors. Though, in fairness to the Dreamcast, it only had N64 and PS1 to compare itself to.
Yeah, so when the Dreamcast released in September of 1999, it only had the PS1 and N64, obviously. So not a whole lot of groundwork there to be made. They were trying to be unique, but it seems like there's a lot missing there, right? Well, let's go through why it was badly received first, and before we praise it for actually doing some really cool stuff, though. So, one analog stick definitely hurt the console in the long run, and it was very uncomfortable to hold the pad in general, too, just because of the shape of the pad and how your fingers would need to navigate around it. And it was mostly difficult because you had to hold the controller fairly high up on its body.
To be able to reach the button, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit odd to describe, but just imagine having a gamepad and having to hold it too high up. That's the main design problem with this pad. The controller's wire also, this is really weird. So, the controller's wire came from the bottom of the pad, which is definitely taking a big step back from what we've had decades before then. And Sega seemed to know that this was silly because they gave you the ability to loop the wire back up to behind the controller and clip it in place so it comes out the top. So that was also a bit odd there, definitely. But let's look at what the controller did right, okay? And its most outstanding feature was without a doubt its two expansion sockets, similar to the N64's single expansion socket. One of them was housed directly in the middle of the controller and facing the player. This was usually used to house the really cool VMUs, the visual memory units that came with a screen, a D-pad, and four buttons. It was basically like inserting a tiny little Game Boy into your controller, and its main use was that of a memory card to save games onto. But it could even be used together with games to show information only that particular player of the controller should be seeing. You could also remove the VMU and play games on it as well, which is really cool, right? So, Sonic Adventure 2, for example, it allows you to collect little chows in the game, little in game creatures, right? And you could transfer them to that VMU, and then the player could take that VMU out and take it along with him. And can have like a Tamagotchi experience with the thing. And you could even connect two VMUs together outside of the controller whilst you're out and about. So that is actually a super cool thing, I think, these VMUs. They were kind of underutilized though, and it also increased the price of the console, but you needed it to save your games. So it was also, when you look at it more critically, a very expensive way of just saving your games. Also, pretty cool for the Dreamcast controller, by using two magnets within the shoulder buttons, these shoulder buttons became triggers instead. So, when the trigger is pushed down, the magnet creates resistance and allows for pressure sensitive input. Meaning, if you were to use the trigger just a little bit, the player character might walk, and if you fully press it down, it would run because it can read that difference in the trigger. So, that's pretty cool.
And yeah, there you have it, actually, with the Dreamcast, the end of the 90s. And now we are in the new millennium.
Boo. 90s,
Really?
90s was the best time, best
Well, yeah,
decade.
true. I'm not gonna argue that. But we need to be excited because there is a new console in the block. The first console to be released after Y2K was Sony's PlayStation 2 in March 2000. The PlayStation 2's DualShock 2 controller saw very little change. Sony, without a doubt, were extremely confident with the success of the DualShock and saw little need to make drastic changes to it. I would say that's a really good decision, to be fair.
It just comes to show how much the focus and attention to detail the first time around still serves them continuing on into the next generation still.
Definitely. Some games for the PS2 must have been a real head scratcher, though, for players worldwide, when they were confronted with the need to press L3 or R3 button. And you'll be wondering, like, it only have two shoulder buttons on each side. Where are the number three? But
Hmm.
yeah, because apparently that was the only major change to the DualShock 2 controller, the addition of clickable analog sticks. But that was kind of like a new thing at that time. Players didn't know that you can actually press the analog stick.
Yeah, that's true. I remember playing GTA 3, and in one of the early missions, you actually need to park up and sound the horn for someone to come out of a building. And it literally says right then and there, I don't remember which one, L3 or R3, probably L3, but who knows. And I was literally stuck like,
What's
L3?
this?
What is this? I think I even had to bring up the in game menu to find the button layout. And I was like, ah.
Probably someone who didn't read manuals at first.
No,
Yeah.
definitely not. No.
And the only other new feature really were the introduction of pressure sensitive face buttons. So, yeah, pressing harder on the button would actually make you drive faster.
You didn't just, yeah, think that was a thing. Like, no, no, that was actually a thing. Yes, pressing the button harder will make more stuff happen.
Yeah, exactly. The general build quality and weight distribution of the DualShock 2 were the only other improvements, so they kept refining that. And a special point is given to Sony here too. The dual analog and DualShock controllers from the PS1 were actually forward compatible with the PS2. Well, unless you wanted to play GTA 3 like JP, because they lack the clickable analog stick buttons, the L3 and R3, unfortunately. But you can play other games, so all
Yeah,
good.
Ape Escape 2.
Yeah, good game.
Next, in September 2001, Nintendo releases their indigo colored little box of fun, the GameCube. Without a doubt, taking inspiration from Sony's DualShock controller and a little from Dreamcast's too, actually, Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto completely redesigned the controller over the course of 3 years, the longest he ever spent on any controller at the time, though definitely putting their own Nintendo spin on it too. The GameCube controller is a little hard to explain. There's a lot going on here, and it's definitely a unique shot at a twin stick controller. So, firstly, the main analog stick on the left hand side is placed towards the top of the pad, with a D pad sitting underneath it to the bottom right of the left handle. After much discussion at Nintendo whether they even needed to keep a D pad anyway for this new generation of 3D games, right? But now, finally, of course, it would also mean that the thumb can switch between a D-pad and an analog stick easier. Although it's the other way around compared to PlayStation, where
Yeah.
analog stick at the bottom, D-pad at the top. For Nintendo's GameCube, it was the other way around, actually. But on the right-hand side of the controller, though, on the right handle, the analog stick, which took on the yellow C button identity from the N64, was placed in line with the D-pad. So you have to imagine it like your left thumb is higher and your right thumb is lower if you wanted to control both analog sticks at the same time. So a staggered stick layout, basically. Unlike the DualShock, where the two analog sticks aligned and
Yeah.
right next to each other. Noteworthy also about the analog sticks was that the controller casing had octagonally shaped corners. So, for example, if you press up, you would be in a corner to kind of let you know you're definitely 100% up. And then upright had a corner, so you would feel it when you're moving the sticks that you were definitely inside a direction, basically. I think that was also unique. I can't remember any other controller ever having done that. So, very interesting take. Don't know how useful it was.
Well, can you imagine playing Mario Party where you have to move the analog stick with the palm of your hand with the octagonal shape?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, but that's a discount rumble feature, maybe you could say.
Sure.
Also interesting, the C stick. So the head of that, what your thumb rests on, that was smaller than the left-hand side's analog stick. So they were differently shaped too.
Yeah, both of the analog sticks have different shape, basically.
Yeah.
Well, actually, all of them have different shape, no?
Yeah, the face buttons as well. It looks like a piece of art more than like a normal controller. So there was one big green A button right in the middle of the right handle, and it was intended for the player's thumb to naturally rest there instead of, you know how like you would probably rest like maybe on the right analog stick
Yeah.
instead by default. So Nintendo didn't want that. They want you that if you're not doing anything, like your default is waiting on top of that green big A button, basically.
Okay.
Slightly to the bottom left of it, you have a tiny, tiny red B button, and then you've got two kidney shaped X and Y buttons hovering over the A button. So it's definitely very unique in the way that the face buttons are so drastically differently shaped from each other. So, according to Ashida Kenichiro, one of the controller's designers, the controller was to be so intuitive, players forgot that they were holding it. And the controller was to be accommodating to all ages, making for some difficult design choices and a very unique design. And that is how we were left with this piece of art. Lastly, we have two big fat L&R triggers, working very similar to the Dreamcasts in that they're pressure sensitive. However, there's even more going on now because not only is it pressure sensitive, once it's fully depressed, if you give it a little bit more pressure even, it would also click. So you've got pressure sensitive clickable triggers now too. And if you think of it in terms of PlayStation, so you got like L2 and R2, you also had R1, but only R1, not L1. So you had one extra shoulder button on the right hand side. That's where they moved the Z button, which was previously on the back of the middle handle of the N64 controller. So that was kind of odd, but I imagine that's probably to allow for some backwards compatibility because a lot of N64 games was re-released on the GameCube, so it would have made playing N64 games on a GameCube a whole lot easier to understand actually. One thing was for sure, despite its weird design and differently shaped buttons, it was generally very comfortable to hold, and it cemented the fact that 3D games would be best controlled by using dual sticks, and enforcing it as a default in the 3D era, where most games being developed now were 3D. The GameCube shipped with a controller with a built-in rumble feature, and lastly, the following year in 2002, Nintendo released the Wavebird controller. And though it wasn't the first wireless controller, it was definitely the first one that proved popular in mainstream gaming circles.
So if we go back a little bit since the Atari crash or the video game crash, I think the video game industry has been filled with mostly consoles or game from Japan.
Yeah, they're the ones keeping video games alive for a very, very long time now.
Yeah, until now, when Microsoft decided that they too would like to make a video game console, releasing very close to the time of GameCube's release in November 2001, Microsoft releases the Xbox to the world. And together with it, a controller that the team appropriately behind the scenes nicknamed Fatty, but officially called the Duke, which was named after the son of the project manager of hardware, Brett Schnapp. The Xbox's original controller is beefy, incredibly humongous. According to the project's team, Microsoft was aiming for a controller with every feature that they liked from previous available controllers, and it truly shows.
Oh yeah, they tried to do everything they could here.
Yeah, so the pad, first of all, has a real big circular Xbox logo slapped right into the center of it. As if it's not clear enough that it is Xbox, they wanted to make it clearer.
In case you forgot what you were playing, hey, it's Xbox, by the way.
Yup. And it comes with 6 face buttons, which we hadn't seen since N64, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, yeah, aside from the A, B, X, Y buttons, there were 2 more black and white buttons that were crammed into the top of the controller. All of them pressure sensitive too. So, underneath the face button overload, we had one analog stick. On the other side of the pad, we have another analog stick at the top, and digital D pad allowing for 8 directions. So, basically, it's another staggered twin stick layout similar to that of GameCube's.
That's right.
Both sticks were also clickable, just like the DualShock 2. So the Duke had 2 pressure-sensitive triggers at the top and a memory card slot, resembling the Dreamcast controller design, and finally a back and start button too. It had 2 vibration motors for haptic feedback, so now with Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft all releasing their console with controllers capable of vibration, this feature was clearly here to stay and all wholeheartedly adopted now.
Yeah, it's something which I guess it doesn't really sound like much these days. But I mean, if you had a PS6 coming out without like a rumble feature, I think people would be kind of like raising their eyebrows too, like what's going on here. So it doesn't sound like much, but I mean, it has actually massively impacted controllers.
An important thing now.
Mm.
But one really cool feature they added was a breakaway connector in the cable of the controller. So if you accidentally drag the cable with your feet or through the controller in, gamer rage basically, the cable wouldn't drag the console with it.
Yeah, nice little feature there. There really is a lot going on here with this controller, actually, but it's not the true reason for why the controller was actually so incredibly humongous, as you've said, Gabby, right? So, before the design of the controller even started, Microsoft had already tasked their supplier Mitsumi Electric to create the circuit boards for the controller. Definitely a project management error there, if you ask me. Because when they requested Mitsumi Electric to create a stacked circuit board design instead that resembles that of the DualShock 2 controller, they refused to make any changes to their original agreement. And what you're left up with is having to make this big, beefy, chunky gamepad base. Seamus Blackley, one of Xbox's original designers who put together the design team, recalls in an interview with Polygon actually that he would have things thrown at him on stage because gamers were just very unhappy with this controller. It really was a beast, okay? The controller was not well received at all, and Game Informer, which by the way, rest in peace, Game Informer, since they've just very recently shut down, was a very, very long standing gaming magazine. They awarded the controller Blunder of the Year, and IGN ranked it as the second worst video game controller ever. And if you remember, they said that the Intellivision telephone basically was like the fourth worst. So
Telephone.
it's basically a telephone with a disc. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
So yeah, it was a very badly received controller, okay? And because the initial Xbox sales were pretty low too, and Microsoft knew they needed to redesign the controller anyway, preferably before they released it in Japan as well, where players much preferred a smaller form factor, as we know from when Sony released the PlayStation 1's dual analog controller. They redesigned the entire controller. Okay, a redesign was definitely necessary, and they gave it the name Xbox Controller S, and it was definitely less chunky and more sleek, but definitely compromises were made here. So it was very odd what was going on here. So the back and start button moved to a really awkward space between the left analog stick and the D-pads. So they would basically sit underneath your thumb when you were using the D-pad, basically. It was very odd. And similarly, on the right hand side, on the right handle, the black and white buttons were on top of the four regular face buttons. And they now moved them to underneath those face buttons, but even lower down as well. So it also had this really weird thing where you had two buttons hovering underneath your thumb when you were using the right analog stick. All of the disadvantages and criticisms aside, though, there has actually been in recent years quite like a nostalgia happening for the original Duke and Xbox S controller. So much so that like the controllers have actually been re-released. So yeah, maybe yeah, it's true what they say about nostalgia. It wasn't as great as it is as you think now. But yeah, people did love it, to be fair.
Yeah, it certainly is a weird design choice, so whichever way you look at it, whenever you reach for the analog stick, it's almost like they want you to accidentally press those additional buttons at the bottom.
Yeah, well, they had to redesign it, but you cannot change the number of buttons because of the games that are already being in development, right? And have been developed already for the console. So there's only so much you can do, I guess.
So, yeah, things were certainly still very crazy, right, during this new millennium, while the N64 and PS1 laid the groundwork for how to best control 3D games. It was actually the following generation that really tried to perfect the controller itself. It was obvious that a twin stick controller was needed, but that overcrowding the controller with 8 face buttons, for example, just like the Xbox controller S, was also not the way to go. The DualShock controller didn't need to reinvent itself, and Microsoft definitely took notice of this. So, as we know, joining the party late last time around, Microsoft decided they wanted their Xbox 360 to be the first in the new generation of consoles. Released in late 2005, Xbox 360's controller was solid, trustworthy, and weighty, but you know what? It's in a good way, not
Yeah,
like in a humongous way. But why is Xbox 360 though?
maybe it's because the logo is circular.
Yeah, but where's three? You know what? Forget it. Anyway, PlayStation held the crown for best controller since 1998 with the DualShock controller, but things were about to change. The 360 pad ditched the black and white buttons in favor for two bumpers that sat in front of the triggers. So basically mimicking the four shoulder buttons layout of PlayStation that R1, R2, L1, L2, basically. The back and start buttons were moved back to where they belong, in the center of the pad.
Yes, that's where every start button should be, if you ask me, just right at the center. Don't move it away, just leave it there.
Yeah, and the general shape is otherwise very much alike of the Xbox controller S, so not much changing in terms of the general design of it. But the handles have been made wider, adding comfort and just ergonomically a lot friendlier.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very comfortable controller, I must admit. The biggest game changer, though, was the addition of a brand new button and the first of its kind, a guide button, taking center stage in the shape of an Xbox logo that could light up. The guide button acted as a menu button into the Xbox's operating system and pausing your game. Well, unless you're playing Dark Souls, obviously,
Yeah.
and allowing you to browse through your home menu without needing to restart your console. And it was a big game changer, but it was also very much necessary in this new era of internet connected home consoles. The guide button also came with four LEDs around the circular button to indicate the individual player number of that controller. So if you were ever wondering, is this controller the one that's connected into port 2 or port 1, and you have to trace the cable, you don't need to do that anymore. I'll tell you right on the controller. And yes, the Xbox 360 came with both wired and wireless controllers at launch. The controller also came equipped with a headset jack, which was definitely a smart choice, a much easier alternative to plugging headphones into your TV and giving you the ability to talk to your online friends and shout at them for not playing properly. The port was also placed at the bottom of the pad as to not let the wire interfere with the hands. Lastly, the controller port was USB, so you could also use your Xbox 360 controller to play games on your PC. An easy win for Microsoft, of course, there.
Yeah, the pad received much praise and was ergonomically friendly. Many found it to be the most comfortable controller to hold and use for a mainstream console. Though, of course, it wasn't without flaws. The controllers seemed to have an unreliable D pad. Continuing their design choice from their previous controllers, the D pad was basically a large disc. It was overly sensitive and it was not uncommon to accidentally press down right instead of right, for example, especially when holding one direction for a long time. The thumbstick, which used a staggered layout with offset left and right analog sticks, were also prone to wearing out. The small rubber bumps around the circumference of the head would vanish eventually and reducing grip and control under the thumbs because it's going to be slippery.
Yeah, and also like unevenly shaped after a while when it comes to extremes. They get really nubby after a while.
Is that another call for the need of gloves for the player?
Yeah, but we can't call it the power glove. Should we call it the X glove?
Okay, well, there you go, Microsoft. You have it.
Make the X glove.
Make the X Glove. Yeah, so Xbox 360 was extremely well received though, and so did its controller. Having kickstarted the seventh generation, it would remain uncontested for an entire year before the competition released their consoles.
Next competitor was the PlayStation 3, and that was released in November 2006. And unfortunately, plot twist, due to legal issues, they weren't able to ship the console with the flagship DualShock 3 controller as planned. So a company named Immersion sued Microsoft and PlayStation for the haptic feedback technology it used in its controllers. Immersion has actually been named to be a patent troll, a company that relies on buying patents and suing companies for alleged infringement rather than actually making any products or providing any services. We actually briefly discussed patent trolls in our Objection Legally Gaming episode. So while Microsoft chose to settle, probably to make sure that they could just release their controller in time with the rumble feature, Sony actually fought the case and initially lost. And due to this reason, they would release an altered version of their controller, which they named the 6-axis. Sony, of course, isn't going to fix what isn't broken, and few alterations or improvements have actually been made. The L2 and R2 buttons have a little bit more depth to them, and the analog sticks were given a precision boost as well. Similar to Xbox's guide button, PlayStation now had a PS button, serving the same function, but compared to Microsoft, all their controllers were wireless, and wireless via Bluetooth technology instead of radio, which the Xbox 360 used. And although you need a workaround to get it working properly with PCs, the 6-axis controller did work perfectly well with a Bluetooth-enabled Apple Mac.
Not sure what it's for.
Yeah, well, there's not a lot of games for the Apple Mac usually. That's
Yeah.
true. But it was still possible.
Yeah, you can use it. There you go. But you know what? The key new feature of the controller is actually right there on the name. It's that 6-axis motion control. Moving the controller in any direction can be sensed by the console and allowed for additional input in games. Though rumored to have been adapted into the controller very late in development, following an announcement by Nintendo that their upcoming console would feature motion controllers, apparently Sony denied that it was last minute decision. I mean, between me and you, I'm not sure if it was just a coincidence.
It does seem a little bit shoehorned in as a last minute decision. But you know what? I wonder if it had something to do with the lawsuit as well, because they knew they couldn't release a controller that is worse than the DualShock 2. Like, what else did they have left? It's gonna be the DualShock 2 without haptic feedback, without vibration. They can't let that happen either, can they, to be fair?
Yeah, so they really need something to work with. The lawsuit by Immersion was successful at first, but following an appeal made by Sony, they would finally be able to release the DualShock 3 as originally intended in 2007. Apart from obviously including haptic feedback and therefore weighing 40% more, the 6-axis and DualShock 3 are virtually the same. The 6-axis was discontinued in 2008, and Sony got its DualShock controller back in the game. But due to the issues with the patenting and the lack of headphone jack in the controller, we can safely say the Xbox 360 actually had it this time around.
Yeah, that's fine. I think objectively speaking, yeah, they had less issues happening, didn't they?
Yeah,
So
they
yeah.
won the battle this time.
Yeah, they were also a year earlier than the PS3.
Mhm.
That's fine, yeah. Xbox 360, that generation, they probably took the crown for controller. But let's take a look what Nintendo was doing, on the other hand, of course. Nintendo is never afraid to try something new, and neither do they feel the need to compete with other console manufacturers. For their release of the Nintendo Wii, just 7 days after Sony released the PS3, Nintendo hooked the world with its TV remote like controllers. But not TV remote like the Intellivision. These were actually a lot better.
Okay.
Yeah. So, named the Wii Remote, or sometimes the Wii Mode, it ditched traditional convention completely and instead offered a brand new way to play games. It was a great, fun, new way to experience games, and the Wii sold extremely well. As a matter of fact, it sold so well, it sold 10 million units more than either the PS3 or Xbox 360. But how does it hold up when playing the traditional couch potato way? It was somewhat odd to have a remote control in one hand and a separate nunchuck with an analog stick attached by wire in the other hand. Well, Nintendo was smart enough to use the same port as for the GameCube, so players could choose to simply plug in their GameCube controller for the more traditional 3D games.
Well, player one, this episode is getting long, and we're getting real close now to the current state of play. We should probably start wrapping up a little. So, Sony and Microsoft have found their comfort zone and make small improvements to the core design of their controllers. Microsoft's Xbox One controller refined response time for its controller and included haptic feedback in the triggers. Controversially, they replaced their disc shaped D pad with a more traditional cross shape instead, similar to that of PlayStation's, but with a connecting cross instead of the four individual buttons. The DualShock 4 introduced a 2-point clickable touchpad that opened up many possibilities for in game use. They decided to include a headphone jack too, thankfully, so you can just connect your headphone to
And
your
shout
controller and
shout at your
shout
friends.
at your friends.
Yeah.
Again, make it easy to have those game fights, right?
Yes, of course, that's what gaming is all about: competition, fighting, anger, and throwing controllers. So, yeah.
That's
They're,
very wrong.
they're wireless now, so the console will always be safe.
That's actually quite funny because you're probably the last person I know to play competitive gaming.
That's true, my Counter-Strike days are over.
New for both controllers was the addition of a share button to provide additional access to social features like sharing gameplay with friends. So we start seeing that shift now of the way people are playing games.
Today we have the Xbox Series controllers and the DualSense. Yeah, sadly the DualShock name has been laid to rest. The DualSense stands out with adaptive triggers that provide resistance and immersive haptic feedback that can give different sensations like driving over roads or, yeah, speed bumps. Very cool stuff. Without a doubt, these are some of the best controllers ever made, but they also resemble each other more closely than times from the original Xbox, PS2, and GameCube 20 years ago. We're starting to see some uniformity here now. And of course, Nintendo continues to be creative in its own unique way. Joy-Con drifting away from the competition, actually, with its separable controller that can connect to a classic gamepad base for use with TV play, or connected to a handheld screen, and even be split in two to be used by two different players.
Yeah, they definitely still went out there with Switch, which was very interesting and refreshing.
So, Player One, thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the second part of the evolution of gaming controllers and learning of the exciting ways that controllers have changed over time.
Yeah, and what about you, Player One? As we know now, all of the controllers are heading towards a little bit more customizable era. What new features do you want to see in the controllers of the future? Share with us and drop us a message on our website, gaminghistory.club. New episodes of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
Come back in a couple of weeks, Player One, to find out what happens when you remove ladders from pools. That's right, we'll be looking into the history of The Sims. See ya.